Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
Today we have a great topic lined up for you. We're going to talk about recommended EOP or Exchange Online Protection and MDO, Microsoft Defender for Office settings. We're mostly going to talk about the EOP stuff because I think that is a lot more prevalent. There's a lot more E3 customers. If you're using Microsoft 365 Exchange for your email, this will apply to you. The Defender for Office stuff we'll touch on towards the end. That's more for the folks who have either Defender for Office or E5, so on and so forth for that flavor. But real quick, what is EOP? Exchange Online Protection. It is the core of security for M365 subscriptions when it comes to email. And the most basic stuff, anti-malware, anti-spam, anti-phishing. MDO, Defender for Online, is that advanced email security gateway. And there are a lot of things that includes: advanced phishing, impersonation, and of course, protection for all of the Office applications as well, on top of not only Exchange, but Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive and all that other stuff as well, including like sandboxing of links within those, as well as maybe URL rewrites, which, you can argue can and cannot, might not be helpful depending on your standpoint on that. But that's like the ones that compare with the other email security gateways that you might find that are third parties to Microsoft, like Mimecast or Proofpoint, so on and so forth. There are two major security levels in EOP and MDO that generally, if you don't want to mess with anything else, you can just default to either standard or strict built-in policies. And there is a way that you can just say, I want standard security across the board, or I want strict security across the board. And those are different than the default. So default is usually a little bit more lenient, and then you would go in and set your standard policies as well. Now, one thing that I did learn actually by reading some of these settings is that now Microsoft is using a secure by default on a lot of our security products, including EOP and MDO. And we're going to put links to a lot of these documents and walkthroughs in our show notes. But the secure by default is something that tenants can't override, and their policies that are in there that no one who is a Microsoft customer can change. So for example, like if you wanted to allow certain IP addresses or safe sender lists, like the secure by default, the overrides aren't applied to the email that we know is high confidence phishing or high confidence malware. Regardless of if you override it using any other mechanism that is there to allow it, it's still going to get blocked. So there is default protection that's built in that is going to protect you from the things that we know are high confidence bad for your organization. And again, you can't turn this on or off. It is just going to be there. There are a few exceptions to the secure by default, and that includes if you were to configure phishing simulations. So there is a way to configure phishing simulations if you either do it through MDO or, for in this purpose, what we're really talking about is third party, something like Cofense or PhishMe or something like that, where you have a phishing simulator and then you want those emails to be delivered. There is an advanced delivery policy. I'm going to put that in the show notes because it is a whole thing on how to configure it correctly, not just like put it on the allowed senders list or something like that. Like there is an advanced way to do this, and we just don't have enough time to walk through that today. But I'm telling you, if you're using that and you want to avoid getting it caught by the spam or phishing filters that are part of this secure by default, there's a way to do around that. Additionally, there's a way to configure a security or SecOps mailbox, like a shared mailbox that you want submissions to go to. And that mailbox can be used for anything. And you want that to be exempt from the secure by default policies. There is an advanced way to configure this mailbox. It's usually a shared mailbox, and there's a way to bypass the filters so that this SecOps mailbox can get all the bad emails for your SecOps team to analyze. And third-party security filters. So if you are a Mimecast or a Proofpoint or someone who's using a third-party gateway, there is an advanced way to do that to bypass the spam filtering. So there is a way to, if your MX record is pointing to one of those services, you can bypass the spam filtering mailflow rule, even if the message has been detected as high confidence phishing by M365. So that way you're using your third party filter as your spam filter rather than M365. Again, the documentation is there to follow. I would review it because there are ways that people have gotten around this by adding them to allowed senders list, which we will talk about as from the safe senders point of view. But there are right ways to do this and there are wrong ways to do it. So make sure that you are following the guidance. And then finally, for false positives, you can temporarily allow certain messages that are still being blocked by Microsoft using admin submissions. So by default, allowed entries for domains and emails and files and URLs exist for 30 days. And during those 30 days, Microsoft learns allowed entries and removes them automatically and extends them. So by default, allowed entries for spoof senders never expire. And we're going to talk about that more later on. But if you're using the correct method to submit them to Microsoft as false positives, they will always become allowed in your environment, essentially. And that will be an exception to those secure by defaults. It got caught. It's a false positive. You use the correct method to submit it. It then gets added to essentially Microsoft's filters later on to always allow it for your tenant. I'll take a pause there because that was quite a bit.
Yeah, this is great. So Andy and I both work for Microsoft, by the way, and we work in our field sales organization selling Microsoft security. So this strikes at the core of a lot of what we do. And I think there's a lot of misconception around what is baked into the service, which is Exchange Online protection, versus what's a paid add-on in Defender for Office 365. And Exchange Online protection is not something you can even turn off. It's not an option. There is always that first pass filtering of messages coming into the Microsoft environment before they're delivered to Exchange mailboxes. And it's a really powerful tool. Because Microsoft is one of the largest email providers in the world, we see a tremendous amount of threat signal. And when we determine attacks are true positives, we do add those signature-based detections back into the Exchange Online protection engine. And those become less computationally expensive, easier to manage over time. Now, of course, most attacks are polymorphic, so signature-based detection is not as valuable as it once was, but it's still great to have that first pass of removing cruft and junk from the filtering pipeline as it goes along. And that's really what Exchange Online protection is for. So one interesting thing about this, because it's been around for a very long time, its predecessor, for those who are history buffs, was Forefront Online Protection, or FOPI, as some lovingly referred to it. Because it's been around for such a long time, customers have built up a tremendous amount of exceptions. And I will say, in my position as a field seller of Defender for Office 365, which inherits and uses all of these settings, we would have customers do a bake-off with Defender for Office and then some other solutions, say Proofpoint, Mimecast, Cisco, whomever, and they'd say, man, Proofpoint catches way more stuff than you guys. You could let a ton of stuff through. And almost always, it would come out that stuff was being allowed through because there was some sort of rule or exception that enabled that to pass through. The admins had configured it once, and then it stayed forever, and messages continued to flow through. And so that's where some of this secure by default stuff comes from. There are times we can be very, very confident this is malicious email. Nobody should want this email. This is junk email. No one should want it. And in the past, we would say, well, but the customer said they want it, so let's deliver it to them. And now what we're doing, when Andy talked about how this will override that, is scenarios when we are so unbelievably confident that this is malicious or this is junk, we are going to not deliver it, even though on a normal basis, based on your rule set, we would have. So one of the takeaways from today, as you listen to this podcast or watch it on YouTube, should be to go do a deep dive in your Exchange Online protection policies and rules and configurations and really clean them up. I think every organization has an opportunity to get simpler and more streamlined in their configuration. And hopefully we're going to give you some tools and strategies and ideas during the show to do exactly that.
So we have mentioned these exceptions. And so now let's just do a deep dive on how to safely exempt things or allow things, safe senders, essentially, in your email and organization. There are going to be multiple methods that we're talking about, from starting from the most recommended method to the least recommended method. Okay, so starting off, the best way and the number one method that we recommend, as in Microsoft recommend for allowing email from senders and domains, is something called tenant allow block list. You might ask yourself, what is this? It's actually not something you can directly allow entries into. So it's there, but you can't just add URLs and domains and files directly to this list. The way to correctly do this is through submissions. When there is something that has been blocked that shouldn't have been blocked, whether it be an email attachment, or URL, you would use the submissions page to report that as a false positive. It's the same thing if something was spoofed. Now, we do have some spoof intelligence built into EOP as well as MDO. And if something was blocked because it was spoofed and we believe that it was spoofed, but it maybe was not spoofed or part of something else, you can then again block it, submit it to Microsoft as a false positive. And it'll add it as a spoofed sender because it was originally blocked as a spoof sender. So when you submit it, it'll get added as a spoof sender in your allow block list from the tenant view. And as I said before, when things are blocked and then you're using these admin submissions, when you submit them, they get added in as an allowed entry for 30 days temporarily. And then during those 30 days, Microsoft will learn from those allowed entries, then remove them and automatically extend them. So these will always be there for you in your tenant, and you don't ever have to manage that list. So by default, the spoof senders allow entries will never expire. There's a whole list of like what happens when you do it. Like what happens to email attachments and URLs, like entries are created, or if it's blocked, an entry is created if you submit it. So this is the method. This is the biggest takeaway for any organization, is that this is the correct method to groom your list for allowed senders. Okay. The next one is called Exchange Mail Flow Rules or Transport Rules. This has been used throughout time, basically ever since Exchange has been around. A couple of drawbacks with that. One, you can't use message headers and mail flow rules to designate an internal sender as safe. That's okay. You never should configure mail flow rules when the sender domain as a condition to skip spam filtering. Doing so will significantly increase the likelihood that attackers can spoof the sending domain or impersonate the full email address, thereby skipping all spam filtering and skipping sender authentication checks so that the message will arrive in the recipient's inbox. So, again, I've seen this done at organizations before. Don't use mailflow rules with only the sender domain as a condition to skip spam filtering. Also, don't use domains that you own as a known accepted domain or a popular domain like, say, Microsoft.com as a condition in Mailflow rules, because again, it creates opportunities for attackers to send email that would otherwise be filtered. So one thing that you should just know is that Mailflow rules can bypass spam filters, and you really need to be careful because that is one of the biggest protections that you have. Also, if you allow an IP address that's behind a NAT gateway, you will need to know the servers that are involved in the NAT pool. IP addresses and NAT participants can change. So you need to periodically check your IP allow list because it might be different and you've inadvertently allowed something that wasn't what you intended to with the initial entry. So be really, really careful with Mailflow rules. I wouldn't use this as an allow send type of mechanism. So if you're doing that, I would highly recommend against that. Take a look at that and instead go back to the first method, which is if it gets reported as a false positive, use the admin submission. All right. We'll spend a little bit of time on this next one. Outlook safe senders, the safe senders list in each mailbox that only affects that mailbox. So this method creates a high risk of attackers successfully delivering email to the inbox that would otherwise be filtered. Messages that are determined to be malware or high confidence phishing are filtered. This method isn't desirable for most situations since senders bypass parts of the filtering stack. So even though you trust the sender can still be compromised and send malicious content. You should let the filters check every message and then report the false negatives like we've talked about. When you bypass the filtering stack in this method, it also interferes with 0-hour auto purge, which is another capability that you automatically get when something has been delivered. So there's pre-delivery protection and post-delivery protection, and ZAP, or 0-hour auto purge, is part of post-delivery protection. And that's when we find out, oh, something's been delivered, and then we find out that it is malicious, whether it's the sender or the URL or the attachment or whatever, and we auto purge it from the mailbox. We zap it and it just disappears. That is a setting you want to turn on, and we'll talk about those later, but that's a great setting. And when you use this Outlook safe senders method to bypass spam or use, add domains that you want as safe senders, that can interfere with the auto purge. All right. Second to last one, IP allow listing or connection filtering without additional verification like Mailflow rules. Emails from sources that are in the IP allow list skip spam filtering and sender authentication, SPF, DKIM, DMARC checks. This method creates a high risk of attackers successfully delivering email to the inbox that would otherwise be filtered. Messages that are determined to be high confidence malware or phishing would be still filtered. But, and that's again part of that secure by default. But again, I've seen organizations put like their corporate egress IP, and if it's coming from here or if it's coming from this office, always deliver it. That's obviously not zero trust. It's obviously not a great way to set up your security, in my opinion. So try not to use this unless I can't even think of a method, like a reason why I would ever want to allow an IP to always deliver email from that IP. And then finally, this is the last one and is the most risky one and is also, unfortunately, the most common one that is used. So again, this is something that you should take away from this episode. Allowed senders list or allowed domains list within the anti-spam policy. So within EOP and MDO, there's an anti-spam policy section under policies. And within those policies, you can add allowed senders, either a specific email address or a domain. This is the least desirable way to maintain an allowed senders list or an allowed domains list. You should avoid this option if at all possible, because senders within this policy will bypass all spam, all spoof, all phishing protection, with the exception of the high confidence phishing that we talked about with the secure by default. And it bypasses all sender authentication, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. The only reason you should be using this is for temporary testing. So if you need to like test a spam solution or something like that, or like you need to send out an email or newsletter or something like that and make sure that it's getting there, you can put it on here temporarily for testing purposes and then take it off. This method creates high risk of attackers successfully delivering email to the inbox that would otherwise be filtered. So, and also don't use any type of popular domains here like Microsoft.com or CNN or whatever it is. So I think that is a deep dive breakdown of the ways that you can do safe senders list. And we talked about the best. And unfortunately, the most common one I've seen, especially when people are having issues getting malware and spam in their inboxes and like, what's going on? It's because their allow senders list or allowed domains list within the anti-spam policy is like, 1,000. I've seen 1,000 entries on there before. Just full on domain. Just send it. If you do that, it bypasses the majority of all of our protections. Highly recommend not to do that.
It's worth pointing out that these detection engines, these filtering pipelines have gotten better with time. And so the recurring refrain as Andy was walking through that is if you put this here, it disables all the layers of filtration or many of the layers of filtration over time. It doesn't mean, oh, well, this is going to get blocked. This is going to get not delivered. That's not what it's saying, especially if it's a legitimate message. It's very likely to flow through and be properly delivered. That's the most likely outcome. And so I know we have sometimes allowed ourselves to get in scenarios where we've had, say, executives or senior leadership teams say, this must be delivered to everyone at all costs. And then we go put in these very permissive rule sets that have tremendous downside and negative consequences that come with it. And so this goes back to a concept we talk about on this show all the time, which is articulating the risk of different choices a business may make. And ultimately, if they're educated on the risks and you have articulated them fairly and accurately, if they choose to own them, so be it. However, I think in a lot of cases, we don't do that. I know I was a former email administrator, and I was guilty of many of these, now what I'd consider faux pas in your configuration. But when I, especially someone young in career in my 20s, had someone come to me from senior leadership team and say, we're sending this out and everyone must get it. So put it on the list to allow it through no matter what. I just did it. Now, later in life, I would have a more nuanced conversation about that. And I think that's what we're encouraging our listeners to do is, for the most part, yes, there's a lot of options to do exceptions, allow lists. You should really try to avoid using almost all of them because of the inherent risk of them. And again, it's a different world than it was, where the sophistication level of this filtration was nowhere near what it is today. And so you had a lot more false positives, things that should not be flagged that were. And today, I think that's going to be better. If your message is coming through doesn't look like junk, it's not going to be marked as junk. It's not going to be marked as malware. Versus before, it was with these simpler heuristics and simpler models. If you had one wrong word in there, you could sometimes run afoul of the engines of the day. So we're changing our approach in recognition that the underlying technology has changed as well.
So let's talk about Exchange Online Protection versus Defender for Online or Defender for Office. So EOP versus MDO. And what are some of the major differences? So in EOP, which is the baseline security that everyone gets with Office, E3, Exchange Online.
With an Exchange mailbox.
With an Exchange mailbox, essentially, right? Like you get it. There are built-in protections for anti-malware, anti-spam, anti-phishing, and then some protection for safe links and safe attachments. The baseline protection. Now, that stuff, some of the built-in default policies cannot be changed if you're just using EOP. When you go to Defender for Office, you can then have more granular policies for anti-phish, impersonation, safe links, and safe attachments. All the things that are part of the baseline anti-spam and anti-malware are still going to be there, as well as the base for anti-phishing. But you're going to get more granular things like being able to do safe attachments within Teams, safe links within Word, and more granular spoof intelligence for impersonation. So a couple more details on the EOP settings. When it comes to anti-malware, you're going to be able to define policies of what users can do when a message gets quarantined. So when it's high confidence malware, it's going to get quarantined. Users can't release their own messages that were quarantined as malware. So that's important to know, regardless of how you configure your quarantine policy. If you want users to try to release their own quarantine, they can be allowed to request the release of their quarantine malware if it's something that they were expecting and it got quarantined as a false positive. But again, one of the things that you should take away from this episode is using the admin submissions. Anytime that something happens that wasn't supposed to happen, whether it is a false positive or a false negative, the admin submissions is the best method to try to tune your organization's allow and block list. So if it was a false negative and you submit it, we have people at Microsoft, actual people who will review these submissions. Physical people will look at your submission and determine whether or not it is a correct false positive or a correct false negative when you use your submissions. So please use your admin submissions. If it's anti-malware and it was something that was supposed to be safe, use the admin submission. You can obviously release it as an admin to your user to allow them productivity right then, but submit it. 0 hour, the auto purge is also configured here for the malware. So in the anti-malware policy, Zap for malware is configured there. For anti-spam, the bulk email threshold is 7 by default. And so the higher the number, the more lenient your threshold is. The lower the number, the stricter it is. And so like if you're setting standard security, it's going to default to 6, which is a little bit stricter than the 7 that's by default. If you're doing strict security, it's going to go to 5. I've seen organizations go as far as like 3, which is pretty strict. And then you're probably going to start seeing things that are getting blocked for spam that really aren't spam. So there's going to be a little bit of leeway, but you can play around with that bulk email threshold and tune it to what you think your organization needs. Zap for spam and Zap for phishing is also configured within the anti-spam policies. And we talked about this. There's that allow senders and domains within that policy. Try really, really, really hard not to use this. This is not where you want to build your allowed senders list. And then anti-phishing policies. There's that built-in phishing policy as part of EOP, but if you're using MDO, you're going to get additional spoof intelligence. Real quick on DKIM, you can create DKIM keys for your domain within M365. And of course, SPF and DMARC settings are done within your DNS settings. Microsoft does enforcement on DMARC, DKIM, and SPF coming in, but we don't help you maintain those records if that's what you need to do. So again, like the SPF and DMARC are usually done in your DNS settings. So there are third-party solutions that can help you do that. But yeah, so that's important to have that configured. We can create DKIM keys for your M365 domain. First contact safety tip and the VIA tag are also configured within anti-phishing policies, which I didn't realize that as well. But the VIA tags are like if I'm sending someone an email via a different inbox. Admins do this all the time for like CEOs and C-suite where they'll send on behalf of someone or via this person with this inbox. So those are also configured there. That way, right? Like it's essentially you're spoofing an email, but it may be internal or something like that. So it's not going to get caught by the policies. And then finally, we'll talk about a few MDO settings. So the default anti-phishing policy within Defender for Office does provide spoof protection and mailbox intelligence. There's additional impersonation protection features and advanced settings that are not configured or enabled in the default policy. So you can enable those features by a couple of different ways. Number one, you can turn on either standard or strict preset security policies that we've talked about, and then configure the impersonation protection there. You can also modify the default anti-phishing policy, or you can create additional anti-phishing policies. And one can work. They work in like sequence. So if like you create an additional anti-phishing policy and you want to target only certain groups, you can do that. And then if they're not within that group, they'll still fall back to the default. The default will always be there. You can't delete it or anything like that, but you can modify it. And then, of course, safe attachment policies, safe links for SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and other Office 365 apps are also created within these MDO settings. So you do have to have that advanced security gateway, that MDO, either Plan 1 or Plan 2, in order to have that protection within the Office apps, which is done by API. So it's not just MX record protection. Like if you're getting phishing from Teams and they send you a Teams message and it is a malicious link, you click on that link, it'll execute through the MDO API, sandbox the link, check it, make sure it's good before you go to it. So I'll stop there. Adam, give you time for some of your thoughts here.
Yeah, this was great, Andy. Thanks for pulling this together. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I would imagine most of our listeners and watchers have as well is that EOP does more than you think it does. It's not just some one-size-fits-all signature-based filtering, but there's a lot more sophistication to it. It is very sophisticated. And even if you don't have Defender for Office, you benefit from customers who do. So when we do things like, and I think I've already mentioned this, but for example, detonating a potentially malicious file in a sandbox and determining, yep, it's malicious, we do take that signature and filter it back through all of the EOP filtering models, as well as any of the related metadata associated with that message, and use that to learn more moving forward. So it's a really virtuous cycle, a harmonious cycle between the two products, where MDO does add more capabilities. However, all our customers get a pretty solid level of protection out of the box for every Exchange mailbox. And I will also say, this is an area of intense investment and development within Microsoft. We've been really focused on making these products even better with time. And we've been getting internal emails regularly from the engineering team on, hey, here's the improvements we've seen month over month in terms of reducing the number of false negatives, as an example. And obviously I cannot share that chart, but I can describe it and tell you that it's a line going down and to the right over time. As time has passed on the x-axis, the number of false negatives has significantly declined with time. Much more improved compared to from whence it came. So even if you've been looking at other third-party filtering solutions, it's always worth another look to see if you can do it all in an integrated stack, because you get all this capability Andy just talked about. And there's ways we've learned and we're educating our customers on how to better configure this with time. But then it goes back to something we always talk about on this show, which is doing more with less, being really efficient with our time and our investigations. And if you can then take all the alerts that are generated from these email security gateways and bring them in the context of other alerts from cloud identity, on-premises identity, from endpoint, from SaaS security, and contextualize them, it's really, really valuable. And that's something you can do as well. So really great stuff. Hope you learned a lot, probably a lot to unpack and view. So be sure to check out the show notes for all of the links to the documentation we talked about, and understand that email is maybe the most mission critical of all the systems IT operates, and there is very little tolerance for change or downtime or any negative user impact. Understand that. But this is also possibly one of your largest, if not the largest threat vectors in your organization. So it's incumbent upon our security defenders listening to this show to do this job and do it well. And that means peeling back some of these exceptions we've allowed over time and doing them through the right process that Andy talked about. So really, really, really good stuff here. If you take away some of the learnings from this show, you will be in a better place from a security posture perspective moving forward. And that is why we love doing this show.
One final thought as you were talking there, Adam, because you said that we are making significant investments and there are these weekly calls with engineering, and I've been sitting on them as well. And one of the things that I think is difficult is that as defenders, we are always playing that cat and mouse game. Attackers will come up with different methods. They will try to bypass the protections that are in place, and we're always trying to come up with protections to their new methods of attack. And so with that in mind, just like with any other security tool, nothing is 100%. So whether it's EOP you're using or Defender for Office or Mimecast or Proofpoint or some other email security, there's always going to be things that get through. And what's important to know, again, is that when those things get through, at least with Microsoft, you have not only the Outlook.com email, but you also have all the other organizations that are using Microsoft Security. If you're using that admin submission, everyone's going to benefit. Somebody else is going to benefit. And so make sure you're using that. That's the best way to report when something gets through, if it's blocked by accident or if it's actually a false negative and it got through, which does happen. It's just not 100%. So make sure you're using those submissions to report them, to properly get them on the radar, and then we can change our filtering rules to accommodate and block it for everybody, or allow it in the manner for your allow tenant.
It's a really good point, and you've reiterated it throughout the show. And maybe just, I know we're like delaying wrapping up here, but one more bit of information to help unpack that. A lot of the Microsoft filtering technologies leverage every aspect of metadata and intelligence that comes with a message. Every bit and byte of the header of that email is analyzed for patterns, clues, things we can match against. And so a lot of what Andy's talking about when he wants you to use that admin submission model is because when you put in rules that are maybe just a domain or maybe just a domain and an IP address, you're still not capturing the full fidelity of signal that comes with every single email message and everything that's contained with it in its headers. When you do it through the admin submission process, it retains its full fidelity of the message, and all of the message, every aspect of it can be used to create, modify, update, and improve models to detect it. You're not just keying off of one or two attributes. It's the totality of the message. And that's the difference. And here's how sensitive those systems are. When an email comes in that's been filtered through another protection engine, a third-party one, like say a Proofpoint, and then it comes to Microsoft, we lose a lot of the fidelity of that message, how it originally came in, how it was passed to us, that we can use to do that filtration, and it's not as effective. So that's why all of this is so focused on, we want to retain the fidelity of the message and all of the information surrounding it, all the headers, all the metadata, so we can craft really finely tuned response to it. And that's the overarching takeaway of all of this, is we're trying to maintain fidelity in creating our rule sets and crafting the behavior we want to see.
All right. Hopefully you learned something. I definitely did. We're going to have a ton of documentation in the show notes. Make sure you take a look at that. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.